So in this next part, I'm going to cover objectives 6 and 7, which are the periodic table. And so in order to understand the periodic table, the first thing we have to do is look at the chemical symbols that make up the periodic table. We were introduced to some of these before in Module 2, Objective 1. But I'm going to bring up the periodic table that we're going to use here in just a minute. We'll look at it. So these chemical symbols that we need to know because they were classified as either major elements or lesser elements or trace elements. Those are the only chemical symbols we need to know are the ones for the major, the lesser, and the trace elements. Okay, those are the only ones that you're going to be examined on. Those are the only ones we're going to use in this course because they're the ones that we're going to need in order to understand the atoms, molecules, and compounds in the human body. The easy ones to learn are the ones that are just derived from the English names. For example, just to take the first one, aluminum, or as the British would say, aluminium. But aluminum is, the first two letters of aluminum are Al, so the symbol for aluminum is Al. That's a pretty easy one to do. The first letter of boron is B, so boron, the symbol is B. Chromium, we don't use the first two letters, we use the first and the third letter, but still these are letters that appear in the name of the element, and so it's easy to learn the symbol. It's a little more difficult to learn the ones that are derived from Latin, and we've shaded those in red, not just on the left-hand side of the slide, but also in the center here. So for example, we have potassium, which the Latin name for was kalium, so that's how we got K, or sodium, natrium, which is where Na comes from, or iron, Fe, is from ferrum. Copper, cuprium is Cu, and tin, stannum is Sn. Once you learn these, then you'll be able to get this joke. You won't get this joke if you don't learn these, so this is your payoff. It's not a very funny joke, but it's a small payoff for learning the names of the chemical elements. So in the first panel he says, take a bite of this Snapple, and the guy says, oh, food, and then he bites into it and it's metal. And he says, well, it's an apple infused with tin, see? And then those of you who know your periodic table should be laughing right about now, or not, because as I said, it wasn't all that funny. So one way to learn the periodic table is to learn them in a song. If you want to learn a song about the periodic table, as I learned them in the 1950s, then a guy named Tom Lehrer came up with this song, which you'll find on YouTube. The shortened versions are shown here. I'm not going to play those for you, but if you want to learn that song, you can go to either one of these versions. They're just two different animations of the same thing. So the elements that we learned earlier are arranged in a periodic table. The elements on the left side of the table are called metals. The elements on the right side of the table are called nonmetals. The farthest right column are the noble gases. So I'm going to go to the periodic table that you have in your book, both in the study guide, but also in the textbook. And notice that the only elements that we're asking you to learn, the names of, the symbols of, are the elements that are in these colored blocks. Okay, the major elements, the lesser elements, and the trace elements. The blue elements, the most important ones, the major elements are the ones we've discussed before. The lesser elements we've discussed briefly before, and the trace elements we've discussed briefly before. The ones on the left side of the table over here are called metals. The ones on the right side of the table are called nonmetals. We don't really need to know the exact dividing line between the metals and the nonmetals, but we have those on the next slide if you want to see them. Over in the far right-hand column, we have some special elements that are called the noble gases. So these are the ones that are over in this column here. They're called noble gases because they refuse to hang out with any of the other elements in the periodic table. They won't even hang out with themselves. So for example, you remember we learned oxygen gas, the oxygen molecule, consists of two oxygen atoms bound together. Well, helium gas is just helium atoms. These atoms are so snobbish they won't even make bonds with each other, so they don't even touch each other. So these are noble gases. They stand apart from the other elements in the periodic table. And because they stand apart from each other, the atoms don't even want to interact with each other. As we saw earlier, in a solid or a liquid or a gas, atoms are interacting with each other to a greater extent in the solid, to a slightly lesser extent in the liquid, and to not very much of an extent at all in the gases. Since these don't want to interact with one another, they're noble gases. They're noble because they don't want to interact with other atoms. They're gases because they just bounce off of each other, these atoms do. So here's the periodic table that I showed you earlier, just a view on the slide. Remember, once again, the only ones that we really need to learn the names of and the chemical symbols for are the ones that are shown here in colored blocks. So it's just the colored blocks that we're going to concentrate on. Remember that I said earlier that on the left-hand side of the periodic table are the metals, and on the right-hand side are the non-metals. So the metals on the left, the non-metals on the right, the non-metals which have the special name of noble gases in the far right-hand column. Again, we can learn a specific dividing line between the metals and the non-metals. We can do that in a chemistry course. In this course, you just need to know in general where the metals are and the non-metals are, and we'll define that later on.